Let's do it. Well, thank you. This is a Climate Action for Associations digital breakfast. I'm hoping that some of you might have met each other before. But I guess the purpose of this is obviously we've convened you together because Gary McFarlane from the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, Gavin Hayes from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, and Sophie Hooper from the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management, obviously all leading institutes in the UK, all exceptionally on top of policy and strategy within your institutes. And Nick Gowan and Chris Langdon from Thinking the Unthinkable are co-hosting this digital breakfast this morning, specifically to talk about the great work that you're all doing from a policy perspective in your respective institutes. And we're looking specifically to have a really quite open, engaging conversation around the role of your institute in terms of the impact that your membership has, obviously, on the environment. To what extent does your institute, is your institute prepared to support your membership to tackle climate change, so the preparedness piece? And what activity and plans do you have in place to support the membership going forward? I was going to leave you all to introduce yourself. I've obviously called you out specifically, and I'm not sure, Nick, I know that you wanted to reference straight away some of the amazing research that, so I actually threw, Emma Adams and I threw, Gavin, your report, Preparedness on for Climate Change report, and Gary, the work that you undertook almost 10 years ago now, I think, we threw that at Nick and Chris quite late yesterday evening, and I know that they've got a range of questions that they're really keen to ask you.
And Ali, should we just explain the basis on which we're doing this? This is essentially on the record and you're recording it.
Absolutely, yeah. We explained that in the email joining instructions. But yeah, everyone, we're recording this, and obviously we're going to watch it before we post it or stream it, and we'll circulate it to you guys as well.
But the aim is really to use this as a multiplier, as a kind of an accelerator at a time of really critical challenge. I'm Nick Gowing. And we met Ali several months ago. We haven't met. She's in Western Australia. I'm in Southwest London. Chris is in North London.
Good morning.
And Chris and I, we have been working for the last 7 years. One or two of you may recognize me. I used to be on television, but and it's been accentuated by the big paper which the government produced yesterday about how the world is changing so fast. But we identified this 7 years ago. And this is not to promote it, but really to underscore why we're talking. Chris and I have both got copies of the book, but particularly the blindfolded leaders struggling, thinking the unthinkable. This was well before COVID-19, and most people thought we were smoking something when we said things had to change, which is why Chris and I are here really to have this conversation with you. We're not reporting anything, we're just really to, as I say, to be an accelerator, a multiplier for what CAFA and Ali and her team are doing. And can we just pay tribute, if we may, to that paper you wrote, Gary, in 2020, because we talked about visionaries actually being also mavericks, and the kind of things you wrote about without profound and significant changes, that's where we're headed when it comes to climate change and the climate emergency. And the kind of things as well that that there are in the organization preparedness for climate change, the internal audit perspective. We can see that this could go forward very quickly. We could move it forward very quickly. But Gary, maybe we could just, this is not about an interview. Please, this is a conversation. Yeah, jump in, sure. Even allowing for Zoom. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
What I'll just say is, in Thinking the Unthinkable, we began listening to leaders, and we have a database of 5,000 pages of interviews. But halfway through the project, leaders started asking our views, and increasingly we're advising leaders about the whole issue of how they address the climate emergency, which is why we're so pleased to be with you and to see the work you've been doing in your various institutes on this approach. And that's really where we'd like to drive the conversation, to learn what you're doing in your association to really lead on this agenda. So back to you, Nick.
Yeah. And Gary, I mean, just what would be useful to hear is, where have you got to? Because when you say at the beginning of your paper from 11 years ago, the systems will fail catastrophically with horrific consequences for humanity, we need to look at the problem through a different lens. Within your organization, are you managing to get people to accept the enormity? And Ali talked about climate change. We need to talk about this as a climate emergency. And I'm just wondering if you could help us throw it forward with, do you have resonance? Do you have leverage? Do you have awareness? Because I think the frightening thing, if I may say, from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, is when your report says over half of CAEs surveyed, 52%, are currently doing very limited or no work related to climate change, and 53% have not discussed climate change with their audit committee, their audit committee chair. I found that deeply scary and quite extraordinary in terms of the blindfolds that are still on people, which matches everything that our work is showing and came out again in the business summit yesterday. Gary, but tell us, are you making waves at the moment, and how are you doing it?
Well, it's a good question, Nick, and as I'm listening to you talk, I suppose about the work I did, as you say, I'm almost scared to admit that it's that's long ago. I think it was probably, I think I probably started talking about this, and I probably, before I say anything, I should probably explain a little bit about where I'm coming from with this. As you all know, by profession, I am an environmental health officer. That's my background. I worked for close to 20 years within the public sector before I took up this role within the professional organization. And the quintessential USP of environmental health professionals is that and this struck me very profoundly when I was doing some work, actually, funnily enough, back around about the time that I wrote these public health articles with public health colleagues on public health competency frameworks for the public health workforce. So I'm going to tell you this story because it will explain better than I can probably articulate what I think the USP of EHPs actually is. And that's fundamentally important to what the question you've asked me. So we were in a room and it was a workshop, and we were put into groups with multidisciplinary public health professionals, medics, nurses, health economists, epidemiologists, and so on and so forth. And we had a grid of headings, and the headings were things like infection control, epidemiology, risk assessment, and so on and so forth. And the task was to look at the head, and then underneath each heading, there was an increasing degree of knowledge and detail. So the further down you went, the more detailed it became. And there was two questions. The questions were, to what extent do you, from your professional background, have any understanding and knowledge in these different heading areas? And the second part of the question was, to what extent do you think a public health professional needs to have an understanding and awareness in these key heading areas? And I looked at it and I thought, I know a bit about all of this. In other words, I was moving horizontally across the headings, thinking, yeah, I know a bit about that, and that's connected to that, and that's connected to that, and that's connected to that. And without exception, everyone else was focusing on either one or two headings and saying, oh, well, I know lots and lots and lots about this and lots about that. But it suddenly struck me that, I mean, I had sort of known this for a very long time, but this is a sort of Damascus Road moment where I really understood it in the context of working with other professionals. Environmental health professionals are able to join the dots and see the interconnectedness between the built environment, people's health, the air they breathe, the water they drink, the houses they live in, the jobs they have, the social interactions they have, in a way that other public health professionals don't get. And that's not to demean, or everyone has it. There's scope in all parts of life for professional disciplines. We need a multidisciplinary approach to everything, not least this particular conundrum.
Are you making inroads now? You've got a new chief executive.
Well, I was going to come to what has happened really, I think, Nick, in the intervening period since the work that you were referring to earlier, is to be absolutely brutally honest, and certainly within the last 4 years, my world has become subsumed by other things, and we have taken our foot off the gas pedal, pardon the inappropriate pun, when it comes to climate change and environmental sustainability. And I choose my word very carefully there. It frustrates me no end that people throw the word sustainability about with gay abandon. And what people mean when they talk about sustainability is environmental sustainability. But of course, the environment is only one of the 3 systems that makes up sustainability. And if you read the article that I think you're referring to, I do unpick that a little bit in that particular article. But the short and truthful answer is that in more recent times, we haven't been as active in this arena as we need to be. However, the positive thing is that we're picking this agenda up again. And I mean, I am very conscious. I mean, I think let's be positive, because I do think that awareness, I'm somewhat dismayed, Nick, to hear you say that the work you've done maybe indicates that the blindfolds are still on, because certainly thinking back 10 years ago, they were definitely on. My perception from what I've read, what I've observed, I definitely think that the awareness of this issue has increased quite substantially in the last 10 years, and that's got to be a good thing. But the problem, and I think the quintessential problem, is this is still somewhere in Never Never Land for people.
Yes.
It's just not imminent enough. And the problem is, it's that analogy that I used back then, which still holds true. There's scary, somebody from Northern Ireland in Belfast, maybe it's inappropriate to use a Titanic analogy, but it is strikingly profound for me, that analogy. They knew there was ice. They knew there was ice. They knew that the warnings were there, and they still didn't slow down. And when they saw it, and when they realized they had to do something about it, it was too late. And of course, the final scary part of the analogy is, who suffered the most in that catastrophe? The most vulnerable and disadvantaged.
That's great. And the reason, I picked on that, and maybe I can come to you in a moment, Gavin, and also Sophie. But it's really important what you've just said, because what you're doing, even though you're surprised about blinders still on, it's not everyone, of course. We see an exponential change, but the reason why we're talking with CAFA, and please come in, Ali, is to try, maybe in the next hour, if we can, to find out how we can mobilize, how we can help people like those you're working with to think in a different way, because this affects them now. It's going to affect their gas boilers, how they get to work, how they run their lives. Can they cut their greenhouse emissions by half within the next 7 years before the climate clock runs out? Yeah. It's that kind of absolute urgency. And I just remind you of what you said, the greatest public health threat of our time, seeing the wood, not just the trees. I'm quoting it back to you to praise you, but how do we mobilize? And that's where I think Ali would like to get us to by the end of this discussion, how we can mobilize all your institutes and organizations and many others to think in a different way. Because if the public is concerned, then governments have got to be deeply concerned as well.
Well, one of the things, and I'm going to shut up after this because I've talked too much already. One of the things that I'm committed to doing again and revisiting is back 10 years ago, we did a lot of work to do two things. One, to connect with other institutes in the public health space. So I'm talking here about the Faculty of Public Health, RSPH, you know, those because I have always held the line that this is not an environmental issue, it's a public health issue.
Yeah.
And because it's going to kill us ultimately if we don't get to grips with it. And secondly, we did a lot of work back in the day to actually try and assist our members with you know, how they can connect with this agenda and contribute to it. So, and I think that holds true for everyone, by the way. I don't think it's just EHOs that have an opportunity to contribute to addressing this. I think every single professional membership body's members have an opportunity to contribute to this.
And
in
also
some
an obligation,
way.
An obligation.
I would say that, yes.
I would go as far as say, Gary, that there's a duty of care almost across institutes and trade associations to take more of an active responsibility across the professions and industries they represent.
And I wouldn't disagree with you at all, Ali.
All right, so we've already got a clear kind of signal of where we can get to, because this is about mobilization. And so, Gavin, can we come to you? Because I don't need to. I'm sorry, Sophie. We haven't shared these reports, so I'm trying to summarize lengthy reports here. But there are a number of remarkable, and I'm going to repeat that because building on what we've just heard Gary say, but you in your report talk about over half of CAEs surveyed, 52%, are currently doing very limited or no work. We need to work out with you, and Ali and her team need to work out with you how we can take this forward, how we can help mobilize. Maybe it's even easier to mobilize from outside rather than inside. But these are truly scary figures and realities, which we're seeing in the finance business, we're seeing in so many areas. It's not my problem. Actually, it is everyone's problem.
Yeah.
So help us understand, Gavin, how we can take this forward.
Yeah, so, you know, as you reflected in the figures that you just mentioned, the Chartered IA and much of the wider internal audit profession is still very much at the beginning of our climate change journey. But obviously we are very excited about the opportunity to be involved and support the Climate Action for Associations initiative. And I think initiatives like this are just so vital if membership associations are not just you know, they don't just talk the talk on climate change, but also walk the walk, and we step up and we start to practice what we preach, which is why I think the conversation today is so important. In terms of the internal audit profession, the role of internal audit is to provide independent assurance that an organisation is identifying, managing and mitigating its risks effectively. And we know from our own research that climate change is very much the most dynamic, new and emerging risk that's moving most quickly up internal audit's agenda. So every year we do a Europe-wide survey of chief audit executives, and every year we're seeing a significant rise in the number of chief auditors citing climate change as a top 5 risk. So
but it's still quite low, isn't it? It's still quite low.
Yeah, so a few years back, just 8% cited climate change a top 5 risk. A year later, it was 14%, so it almost doubled. And then last year it was 22%. But when you ask, you know, what are the top 5 risks in just 3 years' time, it goes up to over 40%. So given the fact that we know this is the most dynamic, new and emerging risk that's moving up internal audit's agenda, you know, that's why last year we worked with Ali and the team and we partnered with the Climate Group on the flagship thought leadership piece that you just quoted, looking at organisations' preparedness for climate change from an internal audit perspective. And that included the survey of chief audit executives. The results, I would say, were a mixed picture. So 45% of CAEs indicated that climate change was a medium risk for their organisation, with 22% leaning towards medium to high or high risk. But then when you sort of look forward, 58% expects climate change to be a medium to high or high risk in just 3 years' time. So we're starting to see the internal audit profession start to take this issue more seriously. However, despite this growing recognition that climate change risk is becoming more adverse, as you touched upon, over 52% of CAEs said that they are doing very limited or no work related to climate change, and only a quarter said that climate change was subject to specific coverage in the audit plan. So we have got a real challenge on our hands in getting the internal audit profession up to speed on this business critical risk. And that is why we did the project with the climate group last year to kickstart that conversation and really start to get this moving up internal audit's agenda. But also off the back of that, we're now planning a follow-up piece of thought leadership on climate change in the run-up to COP26, so that we've got an ongoing campaign, you know, to make sure that it's firmly on the profession's agenda. We're developing new technical content and practical guidance. We're setting up a climate change technical content working group to support the production of that new guidance. And we're looking at embedding climate change risk into our training and qualifications, including a how to audit climate change course. So, you know, as I was saying before, you know, we're still very much in the foothills of our climate change journey, but we're absolutely committed to supporting the profession on this business critical risk.
Let me press you if I can, Gavin, because
Yeah.
in the end, there is an acute urgency now.
There is.
And, you know, surveying is one thing, but you've actually got to mobilize people who take decisions right down through the profession. And I'm just picking up from page 5. I'm not getting geekish about this, but you in this report, which comes well into the this risk in focus, a report which comes well into the pandemic problems, about how the disciplines, procedures, and protections embedded in the DNA of the company have got to change. In other words, it's not about the corporate, it's about every one of us, the human being. And this is right at the root of all the work that Chris and I have done about the human ability to adapt to disruption, because this is not going to affect just your organizations, it's going to affect the lives of the people who are working for the organizations, but they don't really realize they're having difficulty with the pandemic at the moment. But the scale of what is coming down the track, and what I'm trying to encourage you within this intimate gathering on Zoom for Ali and the CAFA, how we can find a way of speeding that up, because COP is still 6 months away, you know, and the carbon clock is ticking. It's 6 years and 9 months away from getting to the point where there's simply no reversibility. Time is marching on, and we've got to cut greenhouse gas emissions by half within 7 years. And I'm laying that on thick because the UN Secretary General Guterres said a couple of weeks ago, this is now a red warning for our planet, not just for your organization. I'm saying this to all of you, actually, but here at 9:13, can we keep pushing it towards how can we move it quicker? How can we empower? How can we energize? And Sophie, I'll come to you as well. But please give us your ideas. You're still in the foothills. When will you be halfway up the Eiger?
Was that question directed at me?
Let me check with Gavin first.
Well, you know, in terms of what the Chartered Institute is doing, I mean, you know, we're doing all we can to get the internal audit profession up to speed on this. You know, and I would hope, you know, that by the time of COP26, you know, the picture is going to look a lot more positive. But in terms of what internal audit can do to support their organizations to be climate change prepared, you know, it's about establishing a risk appetite for climate change risk. It's making sure that climate change is actually on the risk register. It's making sure that the organization has established a climate change strategy that's integrated with the organization's wider strategy. It's making sure that the organisation has done climate change scenario planning to make sure that it's sufficiently prepared. It's establishing climate change and sustainability working groups.
Is it about energizing you on all of that? Is there enough energy, do you think? Is there enough self-analysis on all of this? Because I was talking to the vice president of the SAP group, the big accounting software group, and they're saying they're changing their software to include climate change and new data and so on. In other words, there's got to be internal change because it's going to hit you in terms of the processes you use very quickly.
Absolutely. And the other thing to recognize with climate change risk is that climate change risk isn't just a standalone risk on its own. A bit like the COVID pandemic, it very much impacts on a whole range of other risks. So reputation, for example, regulatory risk, business resilience. So it's about making sure that climate, the way that the organization is managing and mitigating climate risk is to make sure that it's integrated into all of its other mitigation plans for all of those other business critical.
Can we speed that up, do you think? Do you think it's possible to speed that process up?
Well, I think it is, and I think that COP26 provides a great opportunity to make sure that it's on everyone's agenda, and that we do accelerate climate action.
Okay. Well, look, Sophie, you've been very, very, very. Chris, do you want to come in? Chris, you're on mute.
I would like to bring Sophie in now because you have run a sustainability hub at the IWFM. Tell us how you and your members are addressing the climate education and getting your members on board, because they work at an operational level in terms of workplaces and facilities. So what are your members doing now, and how are you guiding them?
Are you in the foothills or are you further up the mountain?
Well, actually, much of what Gavin was saying resonates quite a bit with me. Now, I think much as well as in Gary's situation, workplace and facilities profession, actually, they work quite across the board because they really have to marry the needs of building owners, occupiers, and then supply chain, bring it all together to make sure that the building really provides the needs of the users. And what that means is that they get to affect change in areas that aren't just environmental from a building perspective, but also social and economic. So what Gary was saying earlier on about it's not just about the environmental piece, it's about the much wider piece. Sustainability is really all encompassing. That is something that's really important. And I think the pandemic in a way has given a little bit more opportunity to the FM and workplace professional, because they've had to make decisions or inform more strategic levels about actions that needed to be taken within this field. And because of the pandemic, they've been given more agency and recognition in areas that actually they've already been engaged with for quite some time. And as you touched upon, we've been running a survey since 2007 about awareness around sustainability and the need to do activity in it. And legislation is still quite an important driver, but what we're seeing as well is that the corporate brand and also corporate values are a big driver of needing to move the dial in that particular area. And the pandemic has played a positive role, take that within the context, in that agency, not just from a decision-making perspective, but also because I think the link between environments and the impact on things like public health is becoming much, much clearer. So things like air quality, for which an FM is responsible, has got a direct link to how people will not just perform in offices, but remain healthy in offices. So that integrated piece and the role that our profession plays within that is much more coming to the fore. So from our perspective, including with the prospect of COP26, for which we kind of started to prepare for already last year because it was meant to take place last year, that has kind of firmly put sustainability on the agenda. And it's been there for quite some time, but it's the agency that is starting to change, and which we also are trying to support from a professional body perspective. So we're trying to make sure that we team up with partners that are specialists in the particular areas, because FM and workplace, it's just so broad. You can't just be an expert in everything. So you do need to team up with people that are experts in particular areas, whether it's energy efficiency, renewables, air quality, health and well-being in the workplace. And we're trying to really give tools to our members that cover both the strategic all the way down to the very checklist level. One piece of work that has been very important over the last few years is also social value, because social value it's a procurement tool in a way. It's helping to assess suppliers when you're purchasing services and where they achieve social value, which is in essence are the social sustainability outcomes that you're trying to achieve through your service provision. And that's really helpful in trying to drive very concrete measures through in organizations and in trying to achieve getting closer to outputs. And we launched that framework at the end of last year, and that's really helping to coalesce through service provision some very concrete targets that organizations, NFMs and workplace managers can drive through in organizations.
Would you say, given the role of your profession, it's a critical one, as you've described so well, that your profession is more aware because of the corona crisis of the health issues and the sustainability issues? I mean, do you think is there? We've heard about other professions where there's still some way to go. Are your profession, do you think, by the nature of their work, more ahead of the game?
Yes, but there are, of course, the challenges, and the challenges are those that are financial and times. Those are the top two barriers, really, that the survey has once again reinforced last year. And the reason why those are as such is because you're very often locked in time-limited contracts, and that makes it quite difficult to really take short-term considerations and long-term planning. You really need to bring that together. If you need to overhaul your HVAC system, for example, but you've got a service provider that looks after that only for a few years, how do you marry up the needs to make sure that those systems are more energy efficient, still perform to the best of their ability to make sure that the air quality is best as possible? So there are some challenges around that, where we really have to look at changing approaches and really be focused on the outcomes that we're all trying to achieve together, both from a building owner perspective, supply chain perspective, and the needs of the user.
And given employers have to make offices safe,
yes.
Do you have a short-term incentive driver, if I can use that phrase, because of the need to have offices safe for when people return to work?
I'm not sure how to answer that, because there are, of course, the immediate issues that need to be dealt with. But at the same time, I think we're COP26 and the debate around that, and some of the government initiatives that are coming out, like the building and heat strategy, etc. That is what we're looking forward to. Those are obviously bringing the long-term decisions to the fore. So you need to deal with both, both short-term issues right in front of you. How can you manage that in the short time? But how can you work on those long-term plans where you bring down your carbon footprint from a building? And what are the long-term tools that you've got available to you? How is the decision-making running? How does that meet the corporate values, etc.? What is the long-term strategy? And Gavin said something earlier about that the sustainability strategy should really completely align with the corporate strategy. I couldn't disagree with that at all, because I said something a year and a half ago that actually all we're talking about is sustainability. It should be at the core of everything that we're doing, especially as a professional body. But I would say it's very much to the core of what an FM professional is doing as well, and a workplace professional, because what they do so much so is servicing that sustainability need across the board.
And I'd like to ask a question to all three of you, is how important is the changing regulatory environment? Now, Gavin, that's most prominent in the financial sector, but are the new regulations coming in over the next year, the UK-based ones, and obviously the whole regulatory environment is changing in Brussels as well. How much of that is a driver for change for the internal audit, for the Chartered Institute, Gavin?
I mean, I think it will be a significant driver of change. I mean, for example, we've got the mandatory climate risk reporting for larger companies that was announced by the Chancellor of the Exchequer last November. So that's clearly going to drive change. But what I would say is one of the key messages that came out of our organisation's preparedness for climate change survey is that the internal audit profession would like to see more support from government and more support from regulators in preparing for climate change. 83% of chief audit executives want a universally agreed framework to report financial information related to climate, it's mind-boggling the number of frameworks that are out there for people to report their the financial information related to climate. So the most common one is obviously the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures. The Carbon Disclosure Project Framework, you've got the Climate Disclosure Standards Board Framework, you've got Accounting for Sustainability Framework, you've got the Global Reporting Initiative Standard. So, there are a whole plethora of different frameworks out there for reporting financial information related to climate. And so often it means that we're comparing apples with pears. So in terms of improving transparency around the financial information, we really do need policymakers to commit to a universally agreed framework on all of this.
Ali, Sophie, can I come to you in a moment, and Gary as well? Ali, just come in a moment. We've got a half an hour to run. Keep pressing the buttons. Where more can we take this? I can see some ways forward, but where can you from CAFA see that we need to keep pushing?
Well, it's interesting because everybody, really fascinating discussion as well. Everybody's touching on the point that this is integrated, it's an integrated requirement. Professions and industries can't do it, you can't create the change independently, everything's interwoven. And I'm feeling, Gavin, you just ran through, I don't know how many frameworks you mentioned there from a finance perspective. Where is the policy, the universal standards framework? I completely understand that there needs to be several because of the different professions and industries at play. But actually, the only way I feel like this is going to work and going to work really quickly is through integration and collaboration and partnership. And I'm not certain, and I speak to a lot of institutes, obviously, and trade associations. I'm not sure how much of that collaborative working is currently happening. We're seeing some of the big emitting industries form special task force. Around steel and construction and shipping, and there's a lot of movement in that direction. But in terms of practically how we're mobilizing those sectors and professions, I'd love to hear from you on this, because I'm still not clear on how much work's been going on is going on in that area.
Let me provoke and accelerate a little more. I can't emphasize too strongly the necessity for speed here. And I've written down here, almost overconfidence that the systems are going to be able to respond and provide. In other words, there needs to be that maverick moment that you wrote about 11 years ago now, Gary. In other words, there needs to be that level of vision. Chris and I talk about it in our work as the cost of conformity. The conformity which got you to where you are is no longer relevant and actually disqualifies you from appreciating what is really necessary now. There's also a degree of fear and denial that COVID-19 has been bad enough. No one can really come to terms with the fact that the climate emergency has an acute urgency and it ain't going to go away. Bill Gates said a couple of weeks ago, he said there can be a vaccine for COVID. There cannot be a vaccine for the climate emergency. And my last thought is there fear? Is there actually still denial in your professions? And is that somewhere where CAFA, and maybe us as well, can help persuade people that this is not something which will happen around the corner in a few days or a few years' time? It's going to happen very quickly, and it's going to loom and create floods and everything else in ways which people don't really want to comprehend. Gary, why didn't you come back, and then Sophie? You're on mute at the moment. You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in this space, and I've listened. I totally agree with what Gavin says about standards. I've done some work. I'm chair of the BSI committee on sustainability standards, and I mean, he's absolutely right. But the point about regulation. I mean, as someone who spent close to 20 years working in regulation, absolutely fundamentally important. I mean, why do you think, from building regulations through to the current COVID crisis, unfortunately, people and corporations will just not do things unless there's a framework there to insist upon it. You can boil this down to very simple analogies. I mean, if there wasn't speed limits, would people drive at 30 miles an hour where there was outside schools? No, they wouldn't. I mean, now don't misunderstand me. I am a very strong advocate of facilitating compliance, and I actually, but you need to have the regulatory policy frameworks, and we just haven't got them.
So my question then, just repeated then, Gary, overconfidence in systems to be able to respond.
Absolutely,
necessary.
I agree. I think that's another fundamental issue to pick up. I mean, for some considerable years now across the UK and in Northern Ireland, no exception, the government have been focusing on climate adaptation, and I have been saying for 10 years or more, it is not just about adaptation. If you focus on adaptation alone, you will not manage this. No amount of adaptation will be able to cope with what's coming down the track. So you have to have mitigation in there as well. And the reason why people, look, let's call a spade a spade. This is a huge problem, and part of the problem, it paralyzes people, it paralyzes corporations, it paralyzes individual citizens who think, I'm only a small, tiny speck in this whole system, and whether I change my lifestyle doesn't make one jot of difference. Of course, that's not correct, because what's that great quote, from who's the name, the quote goes, never doubt that a small bunch of committed people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever did. Margaret Mead's, that's who it was, said that back in the early 20th century. But anyway, the point is, that's of course not true, but we have to unlock this, I think, at both citizen-led level and at large policy level. Back in 2006, and I read it at the time, there's a guy called Mark Linus wrote a book called 6 Degrees, Our Future. And now, it almost seems, 15 years ago, 15 years ago, he was saying this, and so were others. Anyway, the point was, I'm going to share this with you because I think it's even more relevant now. I attended a lecture that he gave, which was fascinating and terrifying, all in the same hour. And at the end of it, in the Q&A, I asked him, I said, look, if there was one thing that you could, if there was one thing that you had to pick that you thought would make the most difference to this in terms of moving this agenda forward, what would it be? And he thought about it. He says, that's a really good question. And he thought about it for a minute or two. And he said one word. He said, March. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you have to mobilize the people. It's quite interesting. I'm doing some work at the minute. It's a separate thing, but it's the same point is being made. I'm doing some work at the minute on challenging the government's stance in the UK around our food standards and not actually dumbing those down in order to do trade deals with others, which of course is ultimately linked to sustainability as well. Because, but anyway. And we have come to the conclusion that actually the government aren't going to listen to that unless there's enough pressure from the public. So that's exactly what Mark Linus was saying. And it seems to me that one of the most pressing thing ahead of COP26 is to try and mobilize, and I've written this down and I can write this up and share it. I've written big champions. We need big vocal champions. We need them in TV personalities like Attenborough. But not just that. We need the music world to say it. We need the acting world to say it. We need, we've got Greta and people like that, but there needs to be an overwhelming din created ahead of that summit so that the politicians can't actually ignore it, or they find it more difficult to ignore. That's the way I would put it. And I think there's definitely some, you're talking, Nick, about the urgency, and I'm very struck about what you're saying, because it is terrifying. 6 years and 9 months. I mean, when I started talking this about, it was something like 15 years we had. Now we're down to, less than half of that. I really think there's something about in needing to build not just public awareness, public pressure, advocacy, pressure on governments around the world to actually act on this and stop prevaricating about it.
Ali, this builds on something that we've discussed in the few weeks we've been talking about this. I think you have the opportunity to create champions in this area of associations. Because actually, when Chris and I firmly believe in this with all our case studies and so on, that and this is the beginning of the process, this breakfast, to say this is what this organization's been doing. They realize the problem, they're going to get ahead of it, and this is the way they're doing it. And that's what we believe. Certainly it's the human capacity of chief executives and others, or even leaders of small companies, to think in different ways and to be energized, to be emboldened and so on. But I'm worried, Gavin, and I'll come to you, Sophie, in a moment, but I'm worried, Gavin, because I look at your report and it puts climate change at number 13 in virtually every single graph here. And it is barely going up still when it comes to climate change and environmental sustainability, showing the enormity. And this is coming way behind other big issues, of course, like cyber, like digitization, like financial, like human capital, like disasters and crisis response. But I'm trying to push you in the direction by the top of the hour where we can come away with some real takeaways. We've achieved, in many ways, 12 years change in 12 months because of the crisis of COVID. Is that achievable if you warn people about the climate emergency and what is happening within your institutes, within your organization? Sophie.
Wow, that's a big question.
But it's an important question.
I think it genuinely depends, because when Gary said peer pressure, that's enormously important. But that also then is immediately linked to the holistic approach of sustainability, because when people are worried about their jobs, when they are worried about putting food on the table, they can't be worried about something that doesn't have an immediate impact on them. And that may not be what we would like to understand, but I think that's a reality for many people, which is why we also do things like drive the importance of paying the living wage, for example, because you need to make sure that everyone has got equal opportunities, because then they can address issues that are of importance to all of us. And that's actually basic Maslow's hierarchy that needs to be applied. the urgency is inevitably linked with the legislative driver, both the push and the pull. And then I'm not sure if we can reach things within 12 months, because if we start analysing what was in there in the budget a few weeks ago, then there is a big gap between the rhetoric of the importance of COP26 and providing tools for a wide range of stakeholders.
There was almost nothing in the budget, about green.
There was almost nothing. There was a paper that was released by the Treasury afterwards, where basically it is up to the private sector to end up paying for everything. But if we look at the enormity of the task that's ahead of us, and things like heat strategy in the country, how do we heat our buildings that are very much responsible for large parts of the emissions, then it's absolutely key central that that gets tackled in a budget with supportive measures. It's not just private homes, it's buildings everywhere. Buildings everywhere are just so important contributors to carbon emissions. So we keep on pushing, but there needs to be incentives from a regulatory point of view as well.
Agreed.
And it's not just legislation where we adjust standards for energy efficiency in buildings. There's a consultation that's going on, or how we tackle waste, which is a consultation we're expecting in the next few weeks. There's also a pull from a government and the framework that they apply when they procure services. They buy billions in services, and by expecting suppliers to adhere to certain standards in that, they can bring quite a lot of pull in that as well. But I'm still a little bit on the fence on how much we can achieve, because I think there are certain preconditions that we need to achieve before we can really get to peer pressure.
But that's not a reason to do nothing, though, is it? Or to slow down?
It's not and I don't mean to say that we're not going to do anything. We've got a plan where we're trying to raise as much awareness as possible. We're going to give tools so that our members can just get on with implementing change within their organizations. But if you want to address that society-wide pressure, then I think some questions remain. But we will certainly make sure that we play our part in raising awareness, because it's not just the workplace and the FM and workplace managers that can make a difference. Through the role that those people play within organizations, you can have an impact throughout society. You know, the way that you organize your recycling within an office space, and you kind of drill home the messages around that, hopefully people take that home and they recycle in the correct way at home. Nutrition, if you provide a catering service, you can do things like not just make sure that you provide the right nutrition, you can educate about the way that you deal with waste, but you can also educate about how you can have a nutritionally sufficient diet on a vegan diet, for example. You can share recipes. That may seem very tactical, but it's all about changing the mindset, how every individual can play a role. And we see our professionals playing an enormous role in that. You know, how do you adapt your building so you can facilitate people coming to the office by greener transport, whether that's a bicycle, or you make sure that you've got electricity points, charging points facilitated in the building. So all of that, and ensuring that our members are aware of the variety of tools that they've got available, we will continue to push that message, and hopefully not just to our professionals, but beyond, because of the role they play in their profession.
Okay, well, let's look at the inspiration. We've got 15 minutes left, and Ali, please come back in if you want to keep provoking. But I'm very struck by what Ali wanted to do, is to find out what else is needed, what more is needed. Is it about top down? And, you know, when I look at that figure, sorry, I'm going to quote it for the third time, Gavin, over half of CAEs surveyed are currently doing very limited or no work related to climate change. This is about people at the top, and they've got to create a new atmosphere in which everything changes, and they encourage change. They encourage people to speak up. Can that be done broadly in your industries, with your institutes and so on? Is it top down, or is it going to be increasingly bottom up? bottom up from people who are frightened, as we've just heard from Sophie, about putting food on the table, whether they'll have a job in the coming months, for whom the climate emergency is still a long time away. They call it climate change. If they call it an emergency, it's like the fire, it's like the floods. This is an emergency. So let me help CAFA and Ali and her team take away some really strong ideas. And Gavin, come in, please. How do we mobilize? Is it bottom up, top down? Is it a mixture of everything? Help us understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things that we need to do in all of our communications is really just underline the fact that, you know, this is a climate emergency and that there is real urgency now for organisations to take action. I mean, of course, there have been parallels between the coronavirus crisis and climate change. But, you know, what we need to hammer home is the fact that the impacts of COVID are absolutely nothing compared to those of climate change unless we act now. I think one of the challenges, however, that we face is that obviously with COVID, it's very much going on in real time. You know, we can see it going on around us day by day, you know, the daily death figures that we see on the news every day. The challenge that we face with climate change is that for most people, it's something that's coming down the track. It's not something that's happening right now. It's something that's happening in 3 years' time, or 5 years' time, or 10 years' time. So I think that does create more of a challenge. But on saying that, you know, when governments and when all of us look at the lessons that can be learnt from the COVID crisis, you know, we should be asking ourselves, you know, how can these lessons also be applied to the climate crisis in terms of preparedness? In terms of mobilising all of our members, I wonder whether or not in the run-up to COP26, it might be helpful if we could come up with some sort of climate change pledge that could be made available on Ali's website, that all of our members could sign up to in the run-up to COP26. I think that might be quite a helpful tool.
Can I clarify that? Is that like signing up to net zero, the race to net zero? Because that's exactly what Topping and Mark Carney and the British government are saying. Sign up to net zero by November or you're out. Is that something, is there a nodding going on? Am I seeing everyone nodding or am I off the wall here? Gavin, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it could be something like that, but I think I was more thinking about practical steps that, you know, that we can all commit to as individuals, you know, whether that's switching our energy provider to, you know, a renewable energy provider, or, you know, making sure our homes and our workplaces are all fitted with LED light bulbs, or, you know, switching to paperless offices. You know, it's these simple and practical steps that we can all take in our daily lives that are going to make a big difference.
But the government screwed up already on grants for boilers and so on, and can't even organise that. And companies are going out of business because they're not being paid by the grant system. Gary.
Yeah, thanks. Just to come back to something Sophie said, I was very struck by. I think there's definitely something in this. The point that she made about if all organizations, if all businesses, if all followed a environmentally sustainable agenda, and I've some experience of this, quite a lot of experience actually of this, so I can. That's why I was struck by what she said, because I thought, I've never thought about that before, but she's right. Then that would actually rub off, as so does, that's what I've written down, it would rub off on employees. And that's actually correct. And I'm speaking here as someone who has worked within our organisation to put a British standard in place in the past, which is called Managing Sustainable Development, which it's 8900, BS 8900. There's a whole suite of sub standards came off that for the events industry. That's neither here nor there. and at its heart is culture change in organizations. And that and we did that, and we also put ISO 14001 in place, which is of course the internationally recognized standard around environmental management. And incidentally, back to my point about regulation, because there's another thing at play here. The reason why so many organizations implement ISO 14001 is because it's recognized as the gold standard internationally in terms of how a business organizes its environmental impacts. And secondly, and critically importantly, governments around the world insist on it in the supply chain. And that's why a lot, it's back to my point I was trying to make rather perhaps crassly about regulation. People don't do things unless they are either pushed or pulled, as Sophie very helpfully illustrated. But I think Sophie has something there. So my point is that as institutes, we need to put our own houses in order.
So what do you need to do within your organization to persuade those right at the top that there has to be this cultural change? How is that achievable?
Well, unfortunately, what I've learned is that people, CEOs and businesses, don't unfortunately do things because it's for the greater good or the public good. They do things because they see something in it for them. So what you've got to do here is sell environmental sustainability as a business opportunity. An advantage. Now, increasingly, that actually is the case, and that's why it's linked to public perception. Because the more demand there is for it, the more corporations will do it. So I think, to answer your question, Nick, you've got to actually turn. I have for a long time thought that the language around this is not necessarily. We call it emergency is better, but climate change is just like. What does that mean? It's like that's something ethereal. It's something, how does that affect me? People don't get how it affects them, which is back to my point about it's a public health issue. It's not again, to be rather controversial, and I have had lots of robust discussions with environmental NGOs around this because, unfortunately, I think that talking about biodiversity and ecosystems and planetary degradation and the loss of species, whilst people do listen to that and they think, oh, that's a terrible shame, the flip side of that coin is, so what? Unfortunately, how does that affect me? I know this I'm being very harsh here, but I think, given the urgency of all of this, we need to deal in realities. And
I don't think you're being harsh. I think you're being very realistic. Chris, please come in.
Well, just on that point, I mean, I wonder whether you're not being a little bit unfair to the public when you think of the impact of the Attenborough films on plastic bags. When we saw those pictures of big mammals in the sea with all those bags, I mean, there have been a number of examples where the public motion has changed because of that. I mean, I think we just need to look at those examples and see how we can use those examples and do more of them, rather than this. I agree, this abstract discussion about biodiversity. We work with a top group of conservationists, and they say, let's use the word about nature. People understand about back to nature, rather than these abstract terms. So I only partially disagree with you, Gary.
Point taken, Chris. Point taken. I am being too harsh, and you're right. Although the plastic thing is, I mean, I think one of the reasons why that's been so successful is because it focused on a very specific, tangible issue. And the problem with this is that there's multiple issues we need to address. But you're right. That did have and continues to have a big impact on that particular issue.
But it's poisoning the food that we eat, which means little bits of plastic are going into our body.
Yeah. And it's how, Gary, given you're a systems thinker from what you said earlier, how do we explain to people how everything is interconnected? That's really the critical question.
It is. Yeah, it is. You're right.
We've got about 5 minutes. Sophie, your big idea, please, that Ali and CAFA can take away.
Repetition. It's not very big, but if there's one thing that I've learned from being, throughout my career, it's repetition really strikes home. I don't think it's necessarily about more, or doing more or developing more systems. I think it's about signposting what's already there. You know, Gavin pointed out at the variety of measurement systems that are in place. We don't need more of certain things. We need uniformity of goals. We need focus, actually, as Gary said. And we just need to very methodically understand where we can make the biggest impacts for each of our professions, and then just go down the list of priorities. That's kind of how we're trying to tackle it. We're trying to break it down now in 4 different areas, and just really focus and trying to bring the systems thinking in it, but at the same time, if you don't distill it to very actionable areas, then you do kind of lose your audience, not because they can't stick with it, but just because there's just so much going on at the moment. But repetition on the messaging.
I think there's a famous quote, repetition brings conviction, from F.M. Alexander. But Sophie, let me ask you, do you have a task or a challenge of how CAFA could help this process?
Well, bringing that uniformity of message to the fore. You know, it links a little bit into Gavin's thought around pledge, just having that clarity of focus on what can be done.
We could add to that reputation, reputation.
Wow,
reputation.
Very interesting.
So we got 6 words now.
You asked previously as well, should it be driven down from the top and from the bottom up? Well, it's obviously both. Those at the top have got a responsibility and a duty of care to the people within their organization.
But Gary says they're only thinking of themselves and their careers.
Well, I'm sure we can take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt, but there is an obligation, of course, to make sure that the business remains sustainable.
Exactly. And that's about turning the language around. You're right, Sophie. You're absolutely right. We've got to put this in terms that they go, yeah, okay, I get that. So, you know, I don't know. I can't think of a good example, but you're right.
But to Gary and Gavin, before we wrap up, what is one thing that CAFA and Ali and her team could most do to help you guys along?
No more than a minute each, please. Gavin.
I think, okay.
Let's take Gavin.
Oh, well, I mean, you know, I think, you know, the resources to help membership associations develop their climate action plans, I think that is really, really important. I think in terms of mobilizing our members, I think some sort of pledge or possibly a petition in the run-up to COP26, so that, you know, we could funnel all of our members onto the Climate Action for Associations website. I think that would be really, really helpful. But I just wanted to end on an optimistic note, which picks up on Chris's point about plastic bags, and it just sort of triggered a thought in my head. And that was that in the 1980s, you know, the big environmental catastrophe that we were dealing with was CFCs and the impact that CFCs were having on the ozone layer. And it was because of global action and governments coordinating around the world that now, thankfully, we're starting to see the ozone layer heal itself. So I'm incredibly optimistic that as a planet and as membership associations, that we can step up and you know, take the action that's now required.
Look what was needed to get to that convention, though, Gavin. It took a long time.
Yeah.
Gary, quick word, and then we'll hand back to Ali.
Yeah, just to echo Gavin's point, I share his optimism, and I'm a very keen salmon angler, and I can see massive changes in salmon stocks in 6 months. Just because of the effects the pandemic has had on all sorts of things. But the simple takeaways for Ali, I think a framework or a simple toolkit for membership organizations would be really helpful. And I think it's about simple steps. It's about that, going back to Chris's point about the plastic bag thing and the point Sophie made about, you know, tangible, practical things we could do. And I think there's 3 areas to focus on, and maybe 3 things in each. What can we do with our members? What can we do in terms of our public awareness, and what can we do in terms of advocacy with decision makers? There you go. And if we could produce simple steps, you know, do these 3 things in the next 6 months, and it will make a difference.
Sophie, one task for CAFA before we wrap up?
I'm not quite sure I can add to what Gavin and Gary have already said.
Okay.
That's repetition. Thanks. That's good. That's perfectly good repetition.
Your reputation's intact. Look, can we just say one thing on this book, Thinking the Unthinkable? Actually, what we're talking about is thinking the unpalatable, because everything we've been talking about is coming down the track. It's not unthinkable. We know about it, and we know the scale of what is coming. So we would rewrite our title, but actually it's catchy at the moment, to think of the unthinkable. Ali, thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you.
Chris and me. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, guys. I think just to sum up, I guess, is that membership bodies, institutes and associations are key influencers, obviously, over the sectors and professions they represent, but also that ripple effect that they have onto the general public is enormous. And I feel like CAFA already has a massive range of tools and resources already, and an ability to pledge, but that's obviously for the associations themselves to pledge. Your idea, Gavin, around mobilizing members as well. And I also see Gavin touching on your point, and I love the Titanic analogy, by the way, because we are talking on that scale. We can see the iceberg there, and we're still sailing, we're straight into it. But you know, the idea that you know, consumers are changing the demand of how retailers the products and services, etc., that retailers offer. Slowly but surely there is a shift. You're seeing a shift that actually consumers are changing the way bigger retailers, for example, are going about their business and offering. My view is, I believe that members of associations are going to drive change. They're going to demand that their peak bodies are showing climate leadership and doing something about it. And that's going to require that necessity at board level as well. So it's been an amazing conversation, really good discussion, and thank you so much for taking time out today, out of your busy schedules.
And thanks for the invite. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed your breakfast.
Yes,
we tried. I need to say this. We were trying to source vegan muffins for you all to be home delivered, and it was impossible to find a way to do that sustainably. So I'm afraid we all had we're going to have to pass. But we're determined to find a way to deliver.
It's the thought that counts.
But did your cat?
It was impossible. But there's a business idea for anyone.
Sophie, did your cat enjoy the mouse for breakfast?
I'll go and find out in a moment.
Ali, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to see
Pleasure
you all.
to meet you all.
Hope we meet again.
Absolutely.
Sophie, Gary and Gavin, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Nick, Chris.
Have a good
Take
day.
care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.